to our artist talk with Kellie Romany. My name is Iris Williamson, and I run the New Harmony Gallery of Contemporary Art out in New Harmony. It's one of the University Gallery spaces here at USI. So thank you all for coming. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the ancestral lands of the Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, Osage, Shawnee, Miami, and Quapaw people, and to recognize them as past, present, and future caretakers on this land. This exhibition with Kellie Romany, it opens this Saturday on October 9th. The opening is from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. out in New Harmony. We hope that you can come to that opening. It will also be up and on view during normal gallery hours up until November 13th. So if you can't make it to that opening, we hope that you'll be able to come and see it in real life at some point during the length of the show. We'll have images, Kellie will be sharing images of the work, but to see them in real life is completely different. The surface and the texture of the work is so beautiful, and so I would encourage you all to come out to the show at some point. A little about Kellie Romany. Kellie Romany is an abstract painter interested in bodily representation, materiality, and the history of the painting process. Using a color palette of skin tones, Romany creates objects that act as a catalyst for discussion about human connections, femininity, and race, and the systems surrounding these themes. She received a master's in fine arts in painting from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2011, and a bachelor's of fine arts from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 2008. Romany has exhibited both nationally and internationally, including museum shows at the High Museum of Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, and the Paul Art Museum. Her work is in the permanent collection of the High Museum of Art in Atlanta and the Westtown School in Pennsylvania. Her work has been included in many notable collections, including the collections of Roxane Gay, Theaster Gates, and Rashid Johnson. Thanks so much, Kellie, for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you. I'm going to stay seated because this mic is very precariously sitting right here, so I don't have to hold it, and I don't want it to move and make a crazy rattling sound of any sort. Thank you guys so much for coming, for being here, for making time in your day. I am going to start by reading an excerpt from my artist statement. I use cell-like structures and a color palette of skin tones derived from Felix von Luschen's scale as a visual language to create objects that act as a catalyst for discussion about bodies, human connections, femininity, race, and the systems surrounding these themes. The purpose of reading this is to highlight the process. The work starts with me and my thoughts, then making the object. But I want to suggest for this space is that the object being in the world and the discourse around the object or piece is what is the actual work. The subtle shifts in touch and words of those around us is what brings the final product to fruition and is what actually excites me about being an artist and making objects. Therefore, the work will be presented in tandem with writing of my own and others, a reminder that this work doesn't live in a vacuum and its existence is dependent on that which surrounds it. With that, I invite you all to interrupt me at any point in time. Iris will try to keep a lookout, but I probably can see you fine. And I will pause and answer any questions. I'm really hoping for this to be more of a discussion than me just talking at you for 15 minutes. It's going to be a very short lecture because I've pared down the work to what is sort of relevant to the show that is up at New Harmony. I was always interested in the power of the body, both as an image and as an actual mechanism through which we exist and find out who we are. I was interested in what goes on inside, but also what people see you as. I was also looking at the history of the body, questioning issues of representation and perception. The body became the mechanism with which I was able to move my mind around all of these issues of otherness. That's Wengechi Mutu. Abstraction as a way of digesting trauma, T.K. Smith. I do not wish to generate the appearance of consensus where none exists. Darby English. To bring a feminist analysis of my own body experience, of political events, and of art history to painting using visual language, not just to illustrate temporal political battles, but also to offer an empowered, expanded example of what a feminist gaze would produce. Mira Shore. Art, at its best, is a bridge across the abyss of human loneliness. David Foster Wallace. So in the show, you'll see in the back 2 pieces from a series of paintings I call the Von Luschen series. Felix von Luschen's chromatic scale used pre-1950s to determine race using 36 unique colors, gives a language to present and question race. Like the skin these paintings imply, textures and thickness will crack, dissipate, or darken over the life of the work. Each piece in the series is 16 inches or smaller, sized to be face to face with the viewer, a reflection of identity, both mirrored and forced upon. So I believe Iris was touching on this. The paintings are, it's hard to see in the image, but there's subtle areas that are reflected, areas that are matte, and wrinkles that happen throughout times, and the paint does subtly change over time. Are there any questions so far? Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
This is a series, this series is, how many are in the larger series here? Of the Van Luschen?
So I've been working on this for over a decade, and it's a continuous project. So I probably make about a dozen a year.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many. There are very, very many.
Mm-hmm.
And they are all titled based on Felix von Luschen's 36 colors.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, it might be titled 2, 29, 30.
Mm-hmm.
And the titles are based on what colors I see coming forward in the painting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read a poem that I wrote. Evidence of best intentions, absurd, obvious, harmful. Oh, but the beauty of color. Nothing is one thing, everything Creole. This piece is one of the older pieces in today's presentation, and it is actually on canvas. My recent pieces are on clayboard. This piece is titled The Only Possible Outcome, and the title comes from conversations that I've had with my sisters who have young Black sons. The drip is the only possible outcome when trying to accumulate paint on a flat surface that eventually hangs vertically. And the title is formally questioning if the drip is a failure of the painter's control, and conceptually questioning our society for not being able to protect Black men and women. Again, I'm going to go back to T.K. Smith, abstraction as a way of digesting trauma. This piece is titled Boxed into a Corner by a Profound Knowledge of Why Each Direction They Could Take is Always Already Compromised. Mira Shore. So you'll see here that we've gone from the micro to the macro, using these cell-like structures to create narratives, bodies relating to one another in space, bodies stagnant, bodies moving. And I use quotes often, obviously, as you saw how I began the presentation. But this quote I found interesting to me as a painter, and that's what Mira Shore was writing about, was painting. and students painting. But it also seemed very relevant to me as a Black person and as a woman. This idea that being boxed into a corner and the knowledge that any direction you go could be seen as compromised. The next couple paintings also explore bodies in relation to one another. This piece is called Centered, and it's in the show. So go see the show so you can see it in person. And this piece is called The Fear. And I was thinking a lot about the census studies and sort of the legislation that was coming about in 2016. I felt that a lot of it was based in fear. The census says that around 2050, 2052, that Black and brown people will be the majority and no longer the minority in the US. So this piece is also titled on a quote. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. Often my paintings reference the idea of trauma living within us on a cellular level. This is something that is being studied through the descendants of enslaved peoples. They are studying how the trauma actually has changed their cellular structures. And I'm going to read you a poem. There's going to be 2 poems by this author because she's one of my favorite authors. Have you ever heard a Black woman weep over her skin-murdered child? It is the splitting of atoms. It is billions of voices screaming their children's names through her death wail. Trayvon Martin by Nahira Waheed. I'm going to pause again for questions. Totally fine if you don't have any. Okay. This piece is a diptych. It's about, each square is about, I think it was 30 or 36 by 30 or 36. And at the time I moved back to Chicago in 2017, and I was living in Hyde Park. I don't know how many of you have been to Chicago, but it's an incredibly segregated city, and Hyde Park is seen as this affluent, beautiful Black neighborhood. And I was in the process of moving to Logan Square, which is now a very white neighborhood, but was very Hispanic and gentrified, I want to say late 1990s, early 2000s. And so I was thinking a lot about this. It's titled Litmus Test, thinking about how we actually test these communities and why we decide what they are. And then thinking a lot about gentrification and how we as communities are going to reconcile those lost histories. Any other questions? I think that is sort of prevalent and talked about here in Indiana. Any other questions? No? You can tell, go back. Here I've started to become very interested in edge and what it means to interrupt these cell-like structures. So here's a close-up of that. Thinking a lot about systems and how we corral, move, and hold bodies within systems. So the next 2 series, which are, there's some paintings from these series in the show, are titled Collective and a Series of Interruptions. And they really investigate different ways in which I use edge as a metaphor for systems. So this is a part of, of the series called Collective. Freedom can't be contained within a paradigm that is individualistic. One cannot be free alone. Freedom is collective. Freedom is about transforming conditions so that communities can live in more habitable conditions. Angela Davis. The next paintings consider organic movement of bodies and also proximity and touch, and the idea of communal spaces that feel safe and offer a sense of collective freedom. This is another painting from that series, and the previous painting is not in the show, but this painting is in the show. And you can't, it's hard to tell, but this sort of part of the circle is very matte, and it's almost like the parts of the pigment are floating on the surface. Again, hard to tell, try to see the show. This piece is also a part of that series, and I'm going to read another poem by Nahira Lahid. The beauty of my people is so thick and intricate, I spend days trying to undo my eyes so I can sleep. Lace. I thought I saw a hand, but I didn't. So here again, going from micro to macro, thinking of, or sorry, I said that wrong, macro to micro. Thinking about bodies, singular bodies, and what happens to bodies that are placed within systems that interrupt their movement or potential. So this is one of the paintings from a series of interruptions. And again, you can kind of see in the detail the paint that is butted up against the edge and the way that the pigment sort of sits on the surface. This painting is in the show, in New Harmony. This painting is also in the show at the Harmony. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which talks a lot about trauma living within us on a cellular level. And there's a quote from the book: traumatized people become stopped in their growth because they can't integrate new experiences into their lives. So moving back and forth again between micro, macro, micro, macro, I started thinking a lot about what happens to entire communities that are put in these systems that interrupt their movement or potential. The title of this is For Acceptance, also Cut Off Your Nose to Spite Your Face. The title of this piece is Consciousness of the Structure, which is something that Angela Davis talks about in her book Freedom is a Constant Struggle, which I was talking to Iris about. And then this is going to be my very last slide. I told you guys it was going to be short. This piece is in the show as well, and it's titled Contiguous, which means sharing a common border, touching. And have any of you guys read Cheryl Harris? Cheryl Harris's book. She wrote this piece, Whiteness is Property. They remained oblivious to the worlds within worlds that existed just beyond the edge of their awareness, and yet were present in their very midst. That's it, guys. Like I said, I'm very open to questions or discussions. So you guys did save them till the end. All right, see how you do it. We'll start here. go this way.
So composition wise, I know you intuitively move your canvas around while the paint is still wet, so it moves. How much of the composition do you have like pre-planned in your head? Do you like have an idea before you start putting down the wet paint?
Yes, I definitely do. I was talking to the class I visited about my painting process and the fact that I needed to be the paint and I having a discussion. That I don't like just pushing paint to be what I want it to be, that there has to be a give and take there. But I do have sort of I do have an idea or a plan, right? So I know that this is going to butt up against an edge. It's planned out that it takes up 2/3 of the canvas, which 2/3 is a rule that, master painters use when doing compositions.
I'm wondering about, like, I absolutely see and understand the cellular levels that you're discussing, and I love how that goes from community to just like, individual cell and that conversation. I'm wondering if you think about at all, like, kind of the vascular effects of the paint. Like, to me, there's like, especially when you were showing the micro, like the little trails and the little, like, remind me of just like vessels and just the vascular system. Does that play into what you're thinking about?
I don't think I think about the vascular system as much. I think a lot about body and dust and space. Iris is getting to know my obsession with space. And the fact that we are all dust and space. There's a layer in the work there that I do like, and let me see if I can find. And just thinking about even pigment and how the terpenoid will separate the pigment, and then as it dries, what comes to the surface is this sort of dust of color. That interests me. The vein-like quality, I think about that more as edge and as sort of idea of man-made versus organic, and like, using the sort of sharp edge to be systems and the soft edge to be maybe what might more naturally happen if we cared for each other.
Okay, yeah. The line qualities there are just so stunning, especially the just very, again, vascular lines, and then with that harder, still organic, but that harder edge, that play is really, really beautiful.
Thank you. Go see the show. Go see the show.
The negative space is so sterile and bright and white and clean. Can you speak some about that choice to use that really sort of slick and surfaceless or textureless kind of surface to do your work on? It seems really important to how the contrast is just formally, but then also I'm sure contextually how that kind of functions.
Yeah, I've played around with many surfaces. And I just have this affinity for the clay. I think the way the pigment does sit on its surface, but also seeps into the surface, is different than, say, gesso board or canvas. Also, there's this layered meaning of sort of the science and how we have used science to justify things around the body. And so the cell-like structures really come from my sister being a scientist and showing me pathology slides. So it's sort of a nod to the science part of it, the clinical aspect of it. And then also when I paint, I use all classic sort of oil painting materials, so, you know, galkid, linseed oil, terpenoid, those materials. And that's a very layered, simple commentary on the idea of, using the master's language, using the master's tool as a Black woman to make abstract painting. There was a talk that I went to, and I can't remember, it was Michelle Grabner and somebody else, and somebody was like, well, painting's dead. And then the other person said, well, how can that be? We've never actually elevated the paintings of Black and brown people, you know, like to say that it died because Gerhard Richter and Cy Twombly and all of these other people have done all these things, is to say that we don't care about what these other communities can bring to the table and what conceptually they can bring to the table for painting. I'm just going down the rows in case you think I have. Did no. Yes.
I have a question more on technique. Are you layering color or is it happening all at once?
Both. Well, I guess that makes no sense. So I guess layering. Or maybe in some of the pieces, yes, in some of the pieces, no, if that makes sense. Yes.
I have two questions. So the first is, you mentioned a poem about a skin murdered child. What poem is that and who wrote that?
That is Nahira Waheed. She's a beautiful poet. She has a book called Salt that I just think is amazing. She talks a lot about immigration. She has this other beautiful poem that I'll butcher, but she basically says we crossed the ocean, or we broke the ocean in half to get here only to meet a land that didn't want us. I'm butchering it. She says it way more eloquently and beautifully, but yeah, she's a great poet. Let's see, that piece was titled Trayvon Martin 2 because she has 2 poems. And then let me, her name is Nayyyirah Waheed, and both those poems are from the book Salt.
Thank you. And then my second question is, how do you go about choosing your process in which part of the cell gets certain colors? Is it like darker spots represent like more trauma, or how do you?
I would say that part is the more painterly part of the process, and it is definitely the part that speaks to the composition of what the paint is doing. So I lean heavily on, you know, my knowledge of making a good painting to make those decisions. However, it is important to me that the end object does have that reference and allows the viewer to sort of enter that space of thinking of the things I want them to think about. Yes?
Why do you have so much white in your painting?
So
Is there a significance for that?
So the white is really about having this sort of note nod to science, and the note and nod to who was allowed to paint and who was allowed in certain spaces. So the white cube, things like that, I would say, is the reason. I think it just has a more clinical aspect when dealing with such lush, gooey, more textural sort of paint.
And looking at this, all of the things you've shown, there's one that was near the end where the white had some organic shapes. Keep going. See if anybody. Where they switched from just being negative background shapes to being positive shapes in the image as well. not any of these, but it's
Oh.
like I saw it. Yeah, like that one did it.
Oh.
No,
This one?
nope, you go back.
This one?
You see at the bottom and at the top,
Mhm.
instead of the white just being the background and staying back, then it comes forward and becomes shaped too, which
Yeah.
is kind of a nice integration of the.
Yeah, that, that is the playfulness of the painting, and also I think the magic that is the question of what happens to bodies when they're placed in these systems, is that there's no, going back to Darby English's, quote, there's no consensus here. I'll go back to it. Which I truly believe, I do not wish to generate the appearance of consensus where none exists. So I don't believe that any of my paintings answer any question. The hope is that the painting becomes a catalyst for a discussion, between the viewer and the painting, or between the viewers and themselves, or if, the painting is purchased, what that means when the person lives with it and changes subtly over time. Yes?
Oh, sorry.
No, I think you're the only, was there somebody else behind that? I think you're the only person.
I'd love to hear, that was part of it too, is like, oftentimes the surfaces become skin-like, where they crackle or separate and all of that. And even like the chemical process of using like lean over fat, and kind of like the way that the paint structure itself will change over time, and will yellow over time, and that process also, you've talked about living with the painting. So there's something that happens in that element of time, and that element of like change, that I think is really interesting too. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, again, I always think of the work as having these sort of like different layers of meaning. And one thing that I had decided about my work is that it needed to seduce the viewer. I was very intentional about those words. It was sort of this nod to being a woman, getting dressed, going out, and what that meant. Living in a body that is going to subtly change, and that this sort of like relationship that happens when you live with something that you see every day, but when do you notice the change? And so that became important to me because it was part of the metaphor of body. And also, like I said, my sister's a scientist, and maybe that started to become a little bit interesting of learning how paint is just chemical reactions, and studying with people who appreciated that, and then using it as a tool that was able to add layered meaning to the concept of the work. Any other questions?
So, sorry, we talk a lot about having books and like a lot of authors and important political people and like your work and as inspiration. Do you have any other artists that you found inspiration from?
Oh.
Specifically, that relate to this work that you're doing?
I love artists. I think, so there is a quote in here from Wengechi Mutu. She's an artist. She just did this amazing, beautiful sculpture in New York of this, like, I don't even know what to call it, this like squid-like female wrapped around an egg with this water. And this quote is just, I think, really beautiful as a framework for what I'm doing, and also, again, understanding that I'm not making this work in a vacuum. There are all these things happening around me that are influencing it, and really being clear about them. I think that's important to me. I remember talking to Iris and I mentioned to one of my very good friends, I was like, oh, this curator is asking me about a solo show, but I really like being in group shows. And I think it's because while I love my work, there is something really beautiful about seeing artists in conversation with one another, that I just love. I was in a show at Crystal Bridges, the Momentary in Crystal Bridges recently, and a piece of mine, which I don't talk about here, called An Effort to Be Held, which is, it's these ceramic objects that are filled with paint, and again, the paint dries over time, but there's this invitation to the viewer to touch these pieces, thus in an effort to be held. But there was my piece, and then there was a piece by Paul Benjamin Smith, and it was called Strange Fruit, and he had different singers singing the song Strange Fruit. Do you guys know this story? Yes, and it was layered and it was on repeat, right? Strange fruit, and there was something to me that was really beautiful about me creating this piece about bodies, my body, interacting with the viewer, thinking about myself, asking to be hugged or asking to be touched, but understanding that vulnerability, and then the song about strange fruit sort of humming over it. That was just, to me, extremely beautiful. I don't know if that really answers your question about favorite artist. I really like him. Trying to think who else. My friend Greg Bay, who passed away, who I'll use any opportunity to mention him. He made this piece about time, and he had found a treadmill with a wheel, like a tire from a car that he had painted, that when it moved looked like a sunset. And the pace of the wheel was paced so that every 24 hours or something, I'm gonna butcher this, every 24 hours it made the circumference of the world or something, like the pace of the treadmill. I just feel like that's out of the world beautiful. Love Tony Lewis's work. He's a very good friend of mine. I think what Theaster Gates does beyond his work and thinking about community is really special. I think there's a lot of strange things going on there about power, ownership, capitalism, property. That's very interesting, carving out space, safe space for people of color. Simone Yvette Lee, I think, is just incredible. She did a piece in New York in which she opened a wellness center for women, and people could go and buy things or get things, and it was just really beautiful. Was that enough names?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right,
That sounds good. Any other questions?
I really appreciate you guys all being here. I hope you're able to go see the show.
Yeah, it's Saturday, October 9th.
I'll be there.
Kelly will be there 4 to 7. It's also New Harmony's second Saturday, so the other galleries will be open and there'll be lots of activity around there, so we hope you can make it. So
What time is it?
4 to 7 on Saturday. And then we'll have a reception, some food and different things there too. So.
Thanks
Thank you.
again.